And I think very much as well, it's not always just to come and watch me do it because I'm the finished article. It's sometimes, particularly from a coaching lens, and I'm sure we'll get onto this later on, it's also come and watch me and then we'll try and solve this problem together. We also don't want teachers feeling like that they need to be kind of like robots. We want to arm them with lots of techniques, but we also want them to be free up their bandwidth to be able to make really good decisions in the classroom. You can talk a lot about why we're doing things, and that's really, really important as well. But I think until that teacher or those students close that loop and they see that actually I'm gaining success here, it's the same in the classroom, isn't it? You know, when you've got a set of students and they start to really think, you know, I'm actually learning something here, that's when you can start to get that snowball rolling and you feel like you've got momentum.
I think what's great about that is that you could replicate that on a school level and on a trust level. So if any trust leads are listening, they can think, okay, here's a almost like a playbook for how we can develop this ourselves. But even in a school, you could bring in the voices of people that have a core team at the same time. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Scott Wells from the Windsor Academy Trust as we explore his approach to PD at scale and within a school setting. So Scott, it's lovely to have you here. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kieran. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Like I said, the sun's starting to shine, so we're getting into that time of year where, you know, the Six Nations is almost over and the year flies by. I don't know about you.
Well, I mean, I was looking forward to the Six Nations as I am every year, but then all of a sudden couldn't quite deliver this year. So maybe we might change the subjects on that one.
No, too right. I mean, spur a moment for Lloyd, though, who has been a long-suffering Welsh fan.
Oh, yeah. You know. Yeah, it's a tough journey back for the Welsh, isn't it? But I'm sure they'll get there. It's very positive signs, though, I must say. Very positive signs.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone can, it'll be them, won't it? I think the restructuring of the league system, possibly something that could really benefit them. But we're not here to talk about rugby as much as we probably end up spending the rest of the day. We're going to talk about your approach to professional development across the Windsor Academy Trust. But I thought first we started with a little bit about who you are and how you got here today.
I've been teaching, I think it's about 11 years now. I'm from Leeds originally. Started out in actually my primary school. So I ended up teaching at the primary school that I went to, which was a great experience. Taught there for 3.5 years, ended up being acting assistant head at that point. And then just decided to move halfway across the world to Australia. So taught for 5.5 years in the independent sector in Sydney. And then found myself back in Shrewsbury, and I'm now based at Windsor Academy Trust, which is in the Midlands, and I'm professional learning lead. And then another part of my role there is assistant head teacher, so still also on the chalk face, which I think is really, really important as well. So it kind of like balances out, still doing a bit of teaching, but then also getting the opportunities now to work on a wider context across the trust.
I mean, I bet it buys you a lot of credit with the people that you're trying to support in their professional development. The fact that you're also doing this in your day-to-day, I bet.
Yeah, I mean, one of my good friends in Australia, one of our favourite things to talk about, we talk about walking the walk, and I think what better way of being able to do that? I think for me, in terms of that credibility, being able to say, well, come and watch me do it, come and watch me. And I think very much as well, it's not always just to come and watch me do it because I'm the finished article. It's sometimes, particularly from a coaching lens, and I'm sure we'll get onto this later on, it's also come and watch me and then we'll try and solve this problem together, and I think that's really, really valuable in terms of helping people get better. What you don't want is people to feel as if that, that you're kind of up on this pedestal and you're the person who's the finished article. I think that's very much a theme that comes through in our trust is that, none of us are the finished article. We're all here to get better. So I think the fact that I've got the opportunity to be able to walk the walk is really, really important.
And so we've actually been talking for quite a number of years. And Doug Lamov actually name dropped you whenever I interviewed him. And I was like, wow, I know Scott.
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of. We've been very lucky. I mean, I've been at the trust now 2.5 years, and halfway through that first year, we started out on it was called the PIA project. It's like priority education investment areas, and that was schools across Walsall and Sandwell, and we really got to work closely with the TLAC team. So that was kind of like comprised that we had they were called TLAC experts, like UK experts. So my line manager, my boss, Sonia, she was one of those. And what that meant is that we were able to work really, really closely with the Teach Like a Champion team, not only going to their professional development sessions, which have you been to one of their sessions?
Not yet, but hopefully in May, I think I'm going to go to one in
Yeah.
Cardiff.
Or they are when you go into one of those sessions and you see, I think that's where you start to really see like this is so is this what professional development really looks like, and that's where I had kind of had the penny drop moment. But in that project, not only we had the Teach Like a Champion team in, we had Doug, Erica in our school, so they were able to watch me teach, and as a result of that, one of the things that they did quite often is they wanted to find the bright spots. So I was very fortunate they came in and filmed me, and then it kind of snowballed there. We built a bit of a relationship up, and then did a little bit of work with them around their new book, the Teach Like a Champion Guide to Reading, and very lucky to feature in that as well. So yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind really in terms of that. But the fact that I've gone from sitting in my house at 5 o'clock in the morning reading Teach Like a Champion to being in that book is amazing. But yeah, certainly learned a lot through that process, and I think we'll get onto it in a second. It's definitely been a catalyst for how we start to rethink what professional development looks like for us across the trust.
Yeah, two rides. I mean, what a journey! What a backstory. Now, one of the things we know is that teachers are already carrying a huge amount, and when PPA ends up being spent building lessons from scratch at home, something has gone wrong. And that is exactly the kind of problem the Story of Maths is designed to solve. It's a fully sequenced primary maths curriculum built to reduce workload while improving the quality and coherence of what gets taught. Everything is designed to fit together so teachers are not left piecing things together for themselves. Now, we've also been continuing to develop our early years offer, and that now includes built-in professional development for teachers of early mathematics. So it's not just about giving people resources, it's about helping teachers understand the mathematics, the progression, and the pedagogical choices that sit behind it, especially in those crucial early stages. So, if you want a curriculum that's coherent, properly resourced, and designed to support both teacher development and student success, then have a look at the Story of Maths from Alta Education. And I think I'm going to frame it almost as if this role, which you have moved into, as if there was there a problem you were trying to solve when you began to think about how you design professional development across the trust? And what would success look like in classrooms?
One of the things I touched on on what we learned from the Teach Like a Champion team. One of the things that they did really, really well when they started that project, the first thing they wanted to do is they wanted to look for bright spots. They wanted to come around and have a look and see, right, well, where are the shining lights in these schools that we can learn from? And I think that's the beauty of being in a trust. You know, you've got lots of great things going on. So one of our aims, I think, fundamentally is to get into schools and start to think about what brilliant work is already happening and what can we learn from that. What schools are getting great outcomes? What schools are just continually producing great teachers? They've got those ECTs who are coming in and having a really solid start. Like, what is it that those schools are doing? So that's first and foremost, like, how can we learn from those bright spots? And then you pair that with what's the evidence saying. So in terms of the EEF's mechanisms, they've been really, really important for us. And what we start to think about is, so what are these schools doing? How can we then learn from those key ingredients of the key mechanisms that they're implementing? And then also, what can we start to do in terms of codifying this approach? Because one of the things we learned a lot from the PIA project, which I mentioned earlier, is that the codification and that shared language around what excellence looks like is really, really important. It's important for teachers, but it's also important for a professional development standpoint as well. When we're talking about things like coaching, we need to make sure that we're talking about the exact same thing. It's really important. And I think coaching is one of those things that can succumb to the jingle fallacy. I heard this been spoken about on your podcast before, and it's something that's really stuck with me, the jingle fallacy. And that's a key ingredient. We need to make sure that when we're talking about these key elements of professional development, we need to make sure that we're talking about the exact same thing. So I guess first and foremost, learning from those bright spots, but then also starting to think about how can we codify what we know effective professional development looks like. And then I think the final thing for us is also making sure that we've got that purpose behind it. So we were really starting to think about, well, how can we make sure we've got a staff body now who know these teaching techniques inside out. We've had a great learning experience from the Teach Like a Champion team. We've seen what excellent professional development looks like. So now what is that going to look like for us, and how can we start to codify that? And then I think that's really important, because then what we can do is we can free up that bandwidth for schools to be able to think about the important things in terms of what that diagnosis is and what they really want to work on. And then as a trust, we can start to guide them in terms of how they might best approach that. So I guess in turn, it's that we really want to work on it's schools working on kind of like the what's the focus, what are you going to be working on? And at a trust, we want to really start to develop the how of how will we help you ensure that happens in your schools. I touched on those Kennedy's powers in the practice of teaching. I think for us that's been a fundamental paper, because what we've started to think about is, instead of it just being okay, we're just doing professional development for the sake of doing professional development. It's that staff meeting that we've always done on a Wednesday afternoon after school. It's just what we've always done. It's okay. Well, what problems are we trying to solve here? And we're all collective problem solvers. Doesn't matter whether you're in nursery. Doesn't matter whether you're in year 11. We're all in it together, and we're all trying to solve these problems, and what's the best way in which we can solve these problems. So then one of the things we start to think about as well is, well, let's have a look and let's think about our current offer. If we think about those EES mechanisms in mind, what are we currently doing, and how many of those mechanisms are we seeing in our professional development? And that was a really useful exercise, and I would invite school leaders to think about that in terms of what are you currently offering, because it's often things that you think, often it's kind of like, well, why are we doing that meeting? Why is staff meetings looking the way it's looking? And actually, how can we repurpose that time and think about, well, actually, we're doing a lot of things, but we feel like we're building a lot of knowledge, and we're doing a really great job of building knowledge. But actually, how can we start to get goal setting in there? How can we start to get rehearsal in there? So for us, we've kind of brought it down to these key ingredients, and we think that coaching is really important to drive that core change. We think that group rehearsal is really, really important to drive that change. And then we also think that knowledge building is also still really, really important, because that feeds into all of those key elements. And then I guess I think if we're talking about what success looks like in classrooms, we're huge on routines, and I'll talk about the structure of our professional development later on. We're huge on routines, so we want classrooms that are predictable. We also don't want teachers feeling like that they need to be kind of like robots. We want to arm them with lots of techniques, but we also want them to be free up their bandwidth to be able to make really good decisions in the classroom. That's also really, really important. So we can offer those core techniques, but we want that balance between empowerment. We want teachers to feel like they're empowered to be who they are and to do their job, but we also want to arm them with these really effective tools that we think that they'll be able to deploy as and when they need them. So one of the things we talk about a lot is making sure that we've got the right technique at the right time for the right reasons. So that's definitely what it looked like in terms of the success in the classroom. We talk a lot about inclusive teaching and belonging as well, and that's really, really important for us. And I think if you, what better way to have an inclusive practice than having a predictable classroom where students know that these core routines are going to be in place. There's the same routine for teachers getting students' attention. There's the same expectation that students are, paying attention and actively participating in the lesson. That's also really, really important for us. And I think that the final thing it really does boil down to students' knowledge. If you're going in a classroom and students know things, then you clearly shows that you're having an impact.
I mean, you see that on day. I mean, we're recording on World Book Day. Neither of us is dressed up. If anyone's just listening to this episode, and those children who benefit the most from routine, you can tell they want their standard core offering in the morning on days like today. I don't know if you see that yourself.
Yeah.
But it's never more apparent than when, things are quote unquote fun, but actually it'd be a whole lot easier and a whole lot better for everyone if we just stuck to the timetable.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think routines sometimes get a bit of a bad name. I think sometimes it feels as if you kind of like straitjacketing teachers, but absolutely not, because what you're doing is you're just giving them these core ingredients of these things that work really, really well. And then because what you want them to do, you want teachers you want them to get to a point where they're adaptive experts. They've got that, they're freeing up their cognitive load to be present in the moment, to be monitoring and seeing what's in front of them and seeing the data, interpreting the data, and then making a decision of what they need to do next. If you've got teachers who are doing lots of different things and you've got lots of different classes, particularly at a high school level, if students are going from class to class and there's different ways of getting attention, there's different ways of how the lesson starts, all of those things, you could say then, it doesn't necessarily strip teachers of their autonomy or their empowerment, because what it actually does is thinks about the bigger picture, and you've got to think about the student and what it looks like for them. So we think that just having those core things that are really, really important are going to be very beneficial for our students. And then it also frees up teachers to put their energy and their cognitive load into the other elements of the classroom that are really, really important, and be themselves in the classroom as well.
So recently, I mean, even this morning, Pep's headed an autonomy versus individual expression sort of balance, and he's been looking at that relationship. Is there anything you have to do, like perhaps part of whenever you're preparing for change, or is it a case of teachers are on board and leaders are on board with this approach because the trust is almost like a well-oiled machine? Is there anything you do in your practice to make sure that you almost bring people along on that journey together?
Yeah, well, I think I think it comes back to Guskey's work, because I think what you've got is whenever change is happening, I think all teachers, they want to get better. They certainly want the best for their students. And I think you've got, when change is happening, you've got a really small window for teachers to see that positive impact. We talk a lot about it, in terms of like group rehearsal, in terms of coaching. You can talk a lot about buy-in, but the only time that coachee is going to be really bought in is when they go into the classroom, they step into that room and they see that change happening. They need that positive experience first. And I think once you've got that positive experience first, that's really kind of how then it's a catalyst for that change to happen. I think you can talk a lot about why we're doing things, and that's really, really important as well. But I think until that teacher or those students close that loop and they see that actually I'm gaining success here. It's the same in the classroom, isn't it? When you've got a set of students and they start to really think, I'm actually learning something here. That's when you can start to get that snowball rolling and you feel like you've got momentum. So I guess for us, we obviously want to make sure that things are being done well, and I think that's why when we're looking at those bright spots and when we're really going in and studying what those schools are doing really, really well, we can start to think about, okay, well, that's working in that context. What are the core ingredients of that, or what are the mechanisms that we can take away, and start to think about how we can then deliver that across the trust as well. And I think what's great about the Kennedy's work is what that does is it frees schools up to focus on those persistent problems, those fundamental learning problems, so they can be diagnosing what the problems they feel like they're facing at school level. But at a trust level, then what we can do is start to continue building this process that's going to help them solve those problems. So making sure that group rehearsal is really, really effective, making sure that coaching is following the model that we think is the best form of coaching, which aligns with Step Lab and some of Sarah Cottinghart's work. And I think if we're doing that, we're helping them with the how, but then also at a local level, they can start to really focus their attention on the what.
I was mentoring a maths lead earlier this afternoon, and we were talking about, it was an introduction to the mechanisms and the covering all bases, not picking and choosing which mechanisms you wanted.
Yeah.
When you're like planning and you're looking at implementation of things, what's the chicken and the egg situation? And how do you decide what's important for you? Because you've outlined here are the three sort of key things that we think are really, really important in terms of school development and school improvement. Was that like a trust-wide decision, or do the mechanisms change based on what you're trying to achieve? I don't know if I'm articulating that properly, but it's almost like a case of which comes first, the mechanism or the decision to go in a certain direction kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, and I guess it probably starts with where that particular school is on their journey, and where that staff body is, because obviously a lot of schools are very good at building knowledge, and a lot of, I think back to staff meetings over the course of a lot of my career, a lot of the staff meetings that I had prior to joining Windsor is very much it was just knowledge building. I think as a profession we're very good at sharing knowledge. But also, you've still got to check that knowledge is in place, and I think knowledge is really, really important. And because, as we know from the classroom, it's like that Velcro, isn't it? That the more that teachers know about cognitive science, the more than teachers know about Rosenshine's principle of instruction, and all those really, really important things, I think the easier it is to then attach the other elements to it as well. That's not to say that we just focus on knowledge, but I guess then you might have some schools that you've got a staff body who are really, really knowledgeable about, cognitive science and all of those things and how learning happens and what effective teaching looks like. It might be that they just need a little bit more help in terms of bridging that knowing doing gap. So I guess it's a really interesting one, isn't it? And I think that's where ensuring all those mechanisms are present. But sometimes you do need to, it's not that you're just going in there and we're planning a professional development session and going, okay, well, we need to squeeze this in here. We're just going to do that for the sake of it. I think it's really important in thinking about how are you going to do that over time, because sometimes it's quite difficult to fit everything in one session. And I think one of the biggest changes for me has been even those Teach Like a Champion professional development sessions that I was talking about. Like for me, that's the absolute pinnacle of professional development. But that one session alone still isn't enough. It's about those small steps that you're going to be taking, and it's almost like it's a curriculum, isn't it? We can't just focus on one element, one lesson, or one professional development session. It's thinking about that bigger picture, and first of all, identifying what's this problem that we're trying to solve together, and then what are the steps that we're going to take in order to do that. And I think a big thing for me is the revelation of just like, teachers learn the exact same way that students do. And I think for many years, I experienced professional development that very much was very different to what our lessons would look like in the classroom. But I think the more you can closely align how you deliver professional development to exactly how you deliver that curriculum to students, I think the more beneficial it is in terms of getting all of those mechanisms and ensuring that they're present as much as possible over time. And I think for us, one of the things we've started to think about as well is one of the things we do in our coaching sessions is when we're delivering, we use a lot of step lab material. So we're a step lab aligned school and trust. One of the things we do throughout the sessions is we'll give our teachers the mechanisms, and we'll start asking them to kind of like tick them off as we're going through the session. And it's a great opportunity because what that continues to do is it continues to build knowledge. It means that you're really transparent with why we're using these mechanisms and why they're important. But it also gives you an opportunity to check for understanding, to see whether teachers are understanding those mechanisms and how they relate to what we're actually doing.
Like if I think about, teachers who are reluctant to teach mathematics, give them success, make them feel like they are teachers of mathematics, and then they'll eventually be doing it much better than you ever were. And that's exactly how your pupils are too. If you've ever finished an episode of Thinking Deeply about primary education and wanted to go further, to read more, think more, and connect ideas, hey, what you reading for is exactly where you should start. Each week, we curate the best thinking from across education, books that challenge assumptions, research that informs practice, and podcasts that broaden perspectives. From curriculum and pedagogy to sound leadership and international insights, it's your weekly companion for meaningful professional growth. And because we know teachers are time poor but enthusiasm rich, it's concise, evidence-informed, and genuinely useful. Subscribe for free at thinkingdeeply.info. How do you decide what belongs at the trust level versus the school level? We've almost sort of bridged into it with the autonomy sort of question, but is there any decision making, and does that fall on your shoulders, or is it a conversation that you have?
No, it's not. It's definitely not my. I think that it's just ongoing conversations, really. So I work really, really closely with the director of primary. I work very closely with the deputy director of education, and then I also work really closely with the head of research. So collectively, as a team, we're constantly having conversations, and obviously amongst us, we're often in lots and lots of schools. So we can start to get a picture in terms of what the current climate is, and how things are progressing in all of those schools. But also, I think it's important that we also set the direction. So one of the things that we do is we have PLCs. So we get together once a half term, and that includes all the teaching and learning leads, and often their implementation team as well. They're invited together to training sessions. Sometimes they're like full day events. Sometimes they're shorter kind of like drip feeding events to make sure we're kind of continuing that process over time. So we bring things together. And essentially, the year starts, we set the tone by what we call wired classrooms. So for us, making sure we've got the culture, making sure we've got those positive behaviours in place are really, really important for us. So collectively across the trust, at the start of the year, that's what we'll focus on. And then as the year progresses, there's a lot more kind of like schools have got that. Coming back to the word empowered, it's definitely a common theme across our trust is that, as we continue to develop systems around what great coaching looks like, what great rehearsal looks like, how we diagnose those fundamental learning problems and training our leaders on those three areas, then what we want them to do is go away into their settings and start to think about, okay, well, what are the problems that we need to solve at a local level? But then, of course, when we're coming together, that's responsive in terms of those conversations that we're having. And it might be that the deputy director of education thinks, I think we need to just kind of revisit this aspect as well. So there's lots and lots of ongoing conversations and ongoing, like, we'll deliver it and then we'll continue to monitor and see what that's looking like and get a feel for how things are progressing. But I think as well, it's important that we set the tone and we direct what we think excellent teaching looks like. And it comes back to our teaching and learning model as well. So we've set that. We're actually in the process of redrafting that. So it's really exciting time for us to start to think about and continue having those rigorous conversations about what do we actually think really great teaching looks like. So yeah, I think in short for us, it's definitely a balance in terms of schools are certainly not said. It's not kind of given to teachers that you have to work on this and schools that you have to work on a certain thing. It's about making sure that we're developing this knowledge and continuing to build this knowledge around what does great teaching look like at Windsor Academy Trust, and then from that, how can we work backwards to help all of the schools get to that kind of like North Star, if you like.
That's a really exciting task. I mean, how many people are involved in the writing of that or the decision making behind your approach to teaching and learning? Will that be like a round table of the most senior leaders within the trust, or a sample size across the whole group?
Yeah, it's really exciting actually. So we've got all of those people I just mentioned, the education directorate, they're also involved. But what we also want to do as well is we want to make sure that model needs to be for everybody. So we don't just want it to be that it's the senior leaders of teaching and learning or it's the education directorate. we want to make sure that makes sense to an ECT. So what we've started to do, we've had it's a really rigorous process, multiple rounds. I mean, at its core, there's a small team of us that are really working on it, and then every so often that'll be shared with the education directorate, and we'll get feedback on that as well. So in its current state, it's very much a process of we've got to a point now where we've kind of really boiled it down to what we think it needs to look like, and then it's just a case of now thinking about what that playbook needs to look like behind that. So we've got our essential elements of excellent teaching that we feel are really, really important. And then beyond that, we want to make sure that we kind of build that playbook as well. We're obviously doing a lot of work with Step Lab, so we want to make sure it kind of aligns with that. And naturally, that excellent model that Step Lab have produced with the fundamental learning problems and how they've kind of combined that with with Willingham's model of teaching, I think for us has just been an absolute game changer. So yeah, really, really exciting project, but certainly not just all of the senior leaders. We want to make sure that it makes sense to, to our least experienced teachers as well. We want to make it get to a point where someone who joins the trust can have a look at that and say, okay, right, this is really, really useful for me. What we don't want is them to look at that and go, well, I'm never going to get there. So it's a real mixed bag in terms of making sure it caters for all of our teachers and all of our key educators.
I think what's great about that is that you could replicate that on a school level and on a trust level. So if any trust leads are listening, they can think, okay, here's a almost like a playbook for how we can develop this ourselves. But even in a school, you could bring in the voices of people that have a core team at the same time. I mean, you're obviously going in, and when in your role as assistant head, is it a case of, we've got Scott who has this expertise, or do you don a different hat? I mean, is it a Jack and Hyde situation whenever you're in that assistant head role, or do you find you're almost the same? I don't know how to describe it, like the same person, but just doing different duties, or are there two versions of Scott in those two roles?
That's a really interesting question. I think so. At the start of this year, so I didn't have that role at the beginning of the year, and then the opportunity came up, and what I wanted to do is I wanted the opportunity to go in and have the opportunity to develop different aspects of my leadership. The trust wide role of professional learning lead is really, really excites me, and it's a really great opportunity for them to develop that kind of like teaching and learning element of it as well. But I also wanted to make sure that I continue developing other aspects of my leadership, but then also really importantly continue being in the classroom. So I guess it's probably different hats in terms of those different responsibilities, but still within that school, I'm leading teaching and learning. I'm, got a real hand on what coaching looks like as well. So still making sure that all of those things that we think is excellent work working across the trust. And I think the beauty of that is having the trust wide role, isn't it? You get the opportunities to go out there and see the great practice that's happening, and you get to bring that back as well. So that's definitely an advantage. But I think for me, it's just continuing to build all aspects of my leadership. So I'm not kind of closing any doors on myself as well. But first and foremost, with a real focus on teaching and learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that most leaders don't do enough of is go and see other schools. I think I can't recommend it highly enough, even if it just sort of reinforces the decisions you have made, or if it gives you inspiration.
And I think to your point as well, I don't think I've ever been to a school and not taken at least something away. And you think actually that's really, really interesting the way that they've done that, even if it's just a minor tweak. Sometimes it can be like the systems that they've got in place. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that you can have the ideas around, particularly when it comes to coaching, like you can train your staff, you can really develop the knowledge around what coaching looks like. You can have really effective coaches ready to be deployed. But then if you haven't got the systems to enable coaching to happen, then that can be certainly where you fall down. So even just learning from from leaders, this is how I solve that problem. This is where coaching happens, or this is how our staff meetings look, or this is where we do our group rehearsal. There's so many ways in which you can learn from just visiting schools, and you're right. It's a real privilege of mine to be able to do that a bit more often now.
Talk me through the learning design. How do you structure professional development so that it changes what teachers do, not just what they know? Because you've obviously said, schools and trusts can be really good at the knowledge building, but how are you making sure that's, it's the sustained change to practice, the defaulting to almost your or going back to your default when you're tired. How do we make sure that is the most effective version of themselves?
On our best days, we don't really. I mean, we want to continually just get better. And I think for me, at its core, developing teachers is about pulling that kind of like what does your worst lesson look like? So for me, I'm thinking, well, what would my worst lesson look like, and how can I make that even better? And I think if we can get to that point and reduce those like you say, the habits. If we can get to a point where we're really building those habits in our lessons, that we just kind of operate of as many of those things on autopilot as possible, that's really, really important. So for us, we've been very much inspired by, obviously, the work of Step Lab. very much inspired by the work of Mary Kennedy. Mary Kennedy talks about that enactment gap, obviously popularised now for the knowing-doing gap. But then Sarah Cottinghart and Adam Colbert, they're doing some really great work they talk about the idea of a knowing, doing, deciding gap. So that's been really, really important for us. And I think the more I start to think about professional development, the more I start to think about, you've got the knowing, you need to build that knowledge. You need to be able to ensure that teachers can do things, so they build those habits. But then you also need to work on the decision-making element. So we kind of work backwards from that, alongside the mechanisms, to start to think about, well, what is this going to look like for us? Because touched on the jingle fallacy before, as a trust, we need to make sure we're codifying these things. We need to make sure that we can say, right, well, these are the things. Because I think if you just say, go ahead and make sure that you're incorporating the mechanisms in your professional development, you're not really helping leaders solve those problems. So if you can offer them the characteristics, and we obviously know that the characteristics are not the thing that make the change, but if you can give them the characteristics that contain the mechanisms, and we're really big on that. Just because we might have coaching in place, we're regularly, through our kind of QA of coaching and QA of all of our other elements, ensuring that those mechanisms are present. Because I think what you can do is you can kind of rest on your laurels a little bit and just say, well, yeah, we're doing group rehearsal, we're doing coaching, but actually, are those mechanisms still present? Like, are all of your coaches doing 5 rounds of rehearsal, for example? And if they're not, you've got some of those mechanisms missing. So for us, we've really boiled it down to being able to understand. So that Sarah Cottinghart and Adam Colbert, they talk about and they call it an adaptive expertise framework. So we want teachers to be able to understand things. We want them to be able to do things. So we want them to be able to have an effective repertoire of techniques that they can draw upon and do them in a sufficiently habitual manner. We want them to be able to make really good decisions around when to use those techniques. And that's rooted in that knowledge. They need to have great knowledge of how students learn and what excellent teaching looks like. And then finally, what we want to make sure we're instilling is we want that continual element of improvement. And I think for me, one of my favourite things to do in especially when I'm kind of like delivering training to new teachers, maybe in new schools, is I'll put up a picture of all of the most famous sportsmen and women that we've ever seen, like your Tiger Woods, your Serena Williams, and I'll say to them, okay, turn and talk to the person next to you, what have all these people got in common? And they'll start talking about all of these different things, and I'll just boil it down to, they've got a coach, So if Tiger Woods is trying to get better at golf, then I can certainly try and get better at teaching. And I think that's very much the culture that we want to instill. So how do we do that? First and foremost, we've been inspired, very much standing on the shoulders of giants. We've been inspired by Nick Hart. I know he's been on the podcast. He talks about the rhythm of the year. And for us, that's really, really important, because thinking about what you work on is also just as important as when you work on it. And it's really unrealistic to say that you're going to constantly be introducing new things throughout all of the year. We know, like, for example, in primary schools at the minute, we're coming to a point where it's SATs. That's not necessarily the time or the place to be starting to think about bringing in these new big changes. Nor do we feel the start of the year is that time either. So what we always do at the beginning of the year, we call that, and this is again from Nick Hart, we call it the alignment phase. So at that particular part in the year, we talk about nothing new. We're not going to introduce anything new. We're just going to go back to what we feel we do best. And that is wired classrooms. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on ensuring our classrooms are wired. That's a term you'll hear across the trust. We'll talk about, are our classrooms wired? And what we mean by that is the culture right? So are the routines in place? Are we seeing the real positive aspects to attention to mean that we can set our students up for success? And then also in that alignment phase, what we want to do is we want to free up our teachers to be able to build that sense of belonging, build that belonging with their class, build belonging with parents. If you think about the start of the year, you've got potentially new teachers, you've got new students, you've got a new set of parents, particularly in primary, you've got a new parent body that you need to build really good relationships as well. And then if you're on top of that adding a new element of professional development into it, it really is just too much. And we spoke before about Gusky's work in terms of just building on success and allowing teachers to feel like they're having that success. We think the start of the year is a really great time to do that, because we're coming back to the things that we think we're doing really, really well, but also we're just going to do them a little bit better. And I think finally that's great for culture, because it speaks to this idea that, we're all, even though we've done this last year, we're coming back to it because we can all get continually better at this. And this is really helpful for us later down the line when we're narrowing our focus of professional development, because we're all in it together. We haven't got these teachers who are working on different things. I actually wrote a LinkedIn post about this recently. And speaking of Douglas, I've got kind of in the works of hopefully writing a blog on this, but one of the things I was talking about is that, we can learn a lot from sport in terms of their ongoing development. I saw a picture of Carlos Alcaraz, and he obviously has just won his first career Grand Slam. And I saw a picture of, it was a video actually, and he was tossing up the tennis ball and practicing for the first part of his serve, trying to get it into a basketball hoop. And I was just thinking, wow, like he is unbelievable at tennis, and yet he's breaking down that particular technique that he's already really, really good at, and thinking, well, how can we get even better at that? So for us, that start of the year is really, really important because it sets the tone for the rest of the year. In short, it could almost be like the way that you'd see a professional sports team thinking about that pre-season. It's really important, and I think that sets the tone for the rest of the year. So then what we'll do is move into the improvement phase. And that's very much where we'll start to think about these new aspects that we want to work on. And that'll all be driven by those fundamental learning problems. So what are the problems that we're seeing, and how do we feel like we need to solve those problems? And then the final part of the year is the transition phase. So that's towards the end of the year where we're starting to prepare for the next year and think about how we can make sure we've got a strong start. So you've got a real window there of we're still continually improving, but we're just deciding and being really intentional about what those things are that we want to improve on. So that's the first thing in terms of like, when do we work on things? The next thing for us is starting to think about how we're going to approach our professional development. And again, it's come from the mechanisms, but the first thing we want to make sure that we're doing is thinking about how we can, over time, ensure that we've got as many of those mechanisms present. So for us, there's been 4 key ingredients that we boil this down to. The first is a knowledge lab. So in terms of how the week will look for us, we'll have a knowledge lab where we'll specifically be focusing on building knowledge. Then we'll have a rehearsal lab where we're developing group PD. So that'll be all of our staff, all of our TAs will be in there doing group rehearsal. And Josh Goodrich talks about how group rehearsal kind of lays the tracks, and then you've got the coaching that brings home the change. And that for us is where the coaching element is where the changes really, really happen. But then also when you combine those 3 things together, we think that's a really, really effective process in terms of making sure that it's a mechanism-rich approach. When we've looked at it, if you do group rehearsal well, we feel that you tick off all 14 mechanisms in that. And also if coaching's done well, we also think all 14 mechanisms are present there as well. So you've got two parts of the CPL that we're offering each week where you've got all of those 14 mechanisms present. And then the final thing for us, which is really, really important, is when our teachers are in group rehearsal, we also have a teaching and learning assembly that coincides with that. So we'll speak to students about it could be the focus of that week, but it also could be a specific aspect of teaching and learning. And we'll do like video collaboratives in there as well, where we'll show our students videos of like really great classrooms in that particular school and what can we learn from this. Or we might talk to them about why cold call is a technique that we use in the classroom. So there's that real transparency. You know, you'd often, there's times where I'm talking to year 6s about Willingham's model of memory and why paying attention is really, really important. And that's the same in our teaching and learning assemblies as well. So we want that process to be really transparent. So our students also understand why these things are really important. So I kind of break down the coaching element and the 3 other elements, the knowledge lab as well. So when we think about the knowledge lab, one of the things we're also doing there is that can just be, it could be just reading papers. Some key papers that we think are really, really important. It could be watching videos. So we learned a lot from the Teach Like a Champion team in terms of just the power of watching videos. So we call those video collaboratives, and we'll do them in schools, but we'll also do them trust-wide as well. So some of those PLC sessions that I was referring to earlier, they will be video collaboratives where we'll essentially showcase videos from external, but also from within our trust as well, of great practice that's happening. We'll unpick those videos. We'll talk about what's great about them and start to think about those key ingredients. But then also we're utilising Step Lab's great materials. So it could be that we're looking at modules on Step Lab. It could be that we're doing some of the assignments on there. And then also they've got their new evidence-informed teaching that some of our schools have started to have a little play around with now as well. So that very much is the kind of knowledge lab aspect of it. And then we've got the rehearsal. So the rehearsal for us can be something that we think it's kind of setting the tone for the focus of that next particular cycle. Now we do group rehearsal every week, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to move on to something else every single week. So the way that will work is that as a senior member of the senior leadership team or middle leadership team are delivering an assembly to the students on a teaching and learning assembly, all of our staff and all of our TAs will gather, and in that session we'll first of all recap what we've done previously. Then we'll start to see a model in action. So that model can either be a video or it can be the whoever's leading the session contextualizing that model and doing a live model. I really like to do both. I think watching a video of someone doing it, but then also starting to think about how you might tweak that for your context is really, really important, because we've learned a lot from the Teach Like a Champion team in terms of those excellent videos. But I think it's great for teachers to be able to see, okay, well, this is what that would look like in our classroom. Or you can start to, sometimes what I'll do is that when I'm thinking about how my model might look, I might particularly frame it in a way that I think might help one of our ECTs, for example, in terms of solving some of the problems that they're having. So I'll really contextualize that model to kind of support what we feel like the need and the problem is that we're trying to solve in the classroom. Then once we looked at a model, the really important part for us is the rounds of rehearsal, and the Step Lab team, Josh Goodrich, talks about the importance of this. And this is where we start to think about that, bridging that knowing-doing gap, because what we're not just doing is seeing these models and learning about them. We're actually then going to start to think about, well, what is that going to look like for me? And how can I make sure I've got that context-specific repetition? So we'll always do 3 rounds first to build fluency. Sometimes, some teachers might do a little bit more than that, and that's absolutely fine. And then after we feel like we've got to a point where we've built fluency, we'll add a layer of complexity to that. And that's great for us to then also start to feeding other aspects of what we feel are some of the problems that we're trying to solve in our school. And we'll add that layer of complexity, because that's when you're rehearsing, it gets to a point where you feel like you're building fluency, but you want to get to a point where you're really shaping that technique to essentially solve that problem that you've got in the classroom, but also to meet the needs of your learners as well. This obviously, when we're thinking about all of those things, this is always for a lesson that they're literally, in some cases, just about to go and teach. So coming back to Gusky's work in terms of that success, what you're going to get there is you're going to get a teacher who's walking out of that session and they've literally got a script, they've planned. That's a really important element for us is the script. So building up, this is a lot of elements from Switch by the Heath brothers in terms of like scripting your key moves. That's a really, really important element for us, because it ensures that teachers are more likely to enact that change because they've got that particular script in front of them. But also for us, what that can do, it acts as a really good opportunity for us to circulate and have a look at scripts and just really help support teachers to make sure that they're hitting that success criteria as well. So what that then does, it kind of identifies some potential misconceptions before they get off the ground into that rehearsal phase. So then what you've got at the end of this session, after teachers have action planned and thought about what that's going to look like and when they're going to enact that step, you've got teachers who are walking out of that room who have got a script, they've practiced it, they've got some feedback, they've also practiced it in a way that they feel like is a meaningful challenge that they're probably going to face in about 10, 15 minutes time. And the amount of time I hear teachers now come in and say, oh, I did that today and it was absolutely brilliant, it was really, really good. So it's a really great element for us in terms of bridging that knowing-doing gap. So that's the rehearsal, and then we've got the coaching. And for us, the coaching is the real aspect. And obviously we know from Sam Sims' work that instructional coaching is essentially the best bet we have if we get it right. And that's a constant question we're asking ourselves, is just because we're doing instructional coaching does not mean that's the silver bullet. We have to make sure that we're getting that coaching right. In terms of our coaching, we have we use kind of like an expert coaching model. So we've got some teachers within our school, some leaders within our school who are coaches. We think it's really important that it's not just senior leaders who are coaches, because again, that building that culture piece, we want to make sure that we've got teachers who are coaches as well. And we're continually looking to try and build that coaching team up, because we also think that's really, really important. So we've got ongoing training. We're constantly identifying teachers who are going to be the next kind of like coaches, if you like, but we're also making sure that we're regularly QAing and training our coaches. Generally, coaching looks like, so we observe. We've done a lot of training around observations. We think that's really, really important. And again, inspired by the work of Step Lab. But that's really important because we want to make sure that the diagnosis element of it is accurate. We want to make sure that coaches are really great at diagnosing the things that we want to work on. And that's where those fundamental learning problems come in, because they act as a curriculum. There's no point moving on to drive thought if the teacher hasn't secured attention. So that really helps us in terms of acting as a curriculum. But what it also does for us as a school is it acts as a curriculum in terms of what we're going to work on. So the whole process is really, really aligned. Once we've done the diagnosis process, we think that's a really, really important aspect, because we want to make sure that teachers are diagnosing the thing that we want them to work on. What we don't want is teachers going rogue. Josh Goodrich talks about the scattergun coaching approach. Like, we don't want one teacher working on drive thought and another teacher working on securing attention. So what we will do is, before we start to think all of these different elements, we'll design a real tight-knit professional development curriculum, essentially. And that will come off the back of we call it floodlighting and spotlighting. So I'll get onto this in a little bit more detail in a second. So we'll have a floodlight where we'll start to think about what the mapping of the school. And this very much was inspired by some Matt Evans blogs, which I think are great in terms of, he talks about the difference between weighing and mapping. And what we want to really start to do is, every now and again, we want to get a real map of what's happening in the school and how that's going to inform what we want to work on next. And then what we'll start to do, so that's our floodlight, if you like. That's where we're going to have that real wide view of what's happening and start to piece together the current reality in school. And then what we'll do is we'll have our spotlight tours, and they'll coincide with our focus. So once we've developed this focus, That will be driven by the group rehearsal and what that's going to look like. And then the coaching will follow on from that. But it'll be a very, very tight-knit curriculum that we'll build and release over time. So coaches will only be able to access kind of like a limited amount of action steps. And that's really, really important for us, because that means then that we're all working on the same thing. And just as in a classroom, when you're thinking about your active observation, we talk a lot about naming our laps. So when I'm circulating around in the classroom, I need to be aware of what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for 20 different things, I'm not going to be able to check whether or not students are able to do it. And I think it's very much the same in a professional development level. The more you narrow your focus, so we're all aligned in terms of what we're working on, and it should feel really, really small. I think sometimes in my in previous roles, I've made the mistake of feeling like we have to make these real grand big changes, but actually the change is in those real small steps that compound over time. As we've identified this professional development curriculum, the rehearsal will follow on from that, and then the coaching will be strictly around that particular professional development. And that playbook or that curriculum will evolve over time. So then but then obviously I was talking about the diagnosis. That really supports the diagnosis, because it helps coaches, because they're looking for a particular thing. They're looking for something that's within this particular curriculum, and it's real tight knit. So once they've diagnosed what they think is the fundamental learning problem, then they'll move into appraise and prompt. But in that observation process as well, we use Adam Boxer's hypothesis model, which is really, really great for us. And that's been a real game changer for us, because what that does is that kind of brings away this idea of it's my view as a coach versus your view as a coachee, and actually it just brings us to the reality of what have we seen in your classroom, what actually happened. So often we'll also use video as well, which is a really, really powerful tool, because you'll look at it together with the coach. So you're kind of putting the problem in front of you, like, we're going to work on this together, as opposed to, this is what I think, I'm going to give you your feedback and we're going to move on. So the hypothesis model has been really, really useful for us. And essentially what you do there is you go into the lesson and you start to, Sarah Cottingham talks about this idea of getting tripped up. So as a coach, you're using your really strong mental model of what learning looks like and what great teaching looks like. And there's a moment in that lesson where you just kind of like, you start to feel a little bit uneasy. You get tripped up as a coach. So then what you're going to do is you're going to form a hypothesis. So a hypothesis might be, I didn't feel like those 5 students at the front of the class were listening during the explanation. So I think that means that they're probably not going to be able to do that next task as well as they could have been if they were listening. But then sometimes in coaching conversations, it kind of stops there, and the feedback would be, oh, well, you had 5 students who weren't listening. But actually what we need to do is we need to gather some pivotal evidence that's going to be the root of the conversation. So then what you do is you go and check in with those students and you'll say, what did Miss just say? Or what did Sir just say? And if they can tell you, great, you're wrong. So that's rejected your hypothesis, and you have to move on. And that's great, because it also, I think I heard Matt Stone on your podcast talking about the iceberg model, and you're only in that lesson for a short period of time. So there might be an agreement in place with those particular students where they're able to, it could be that there's a need that they may have that needs accommodating, that they are able to, have a little bit of a fiddle toy, or essentially they're jotting down notes or something like that helps them with their cognitive load. You might not know that as a coach, so it's important that you can go in there and kind of check the reality. So once you've found that pivotal evidence or that fundamental learning problem, that will kind of like be the element of the conversation that you're going to be talking about. But we also think it's really important to have multiple routes, because you may go into the coaching conversation and you have to be prepared to go into a coaching conversation and to be wrong. Because again, it's not just that I'm just going to tell you this feedback and I'm just going to give it to you. We're going to build this feedback together, and I'm going to hear what you think and what your side of the story is in terms of why you made those decisions and why you did those things. So that's also really, really important as well in terms of building culture. So then we move into the praise part, and this is a really great aspect of where we get the coachee to really learn from their successes, as Sarah and Adam call it. So we'll give them a specific piece of praise, just one thing, and it's often linked to what they've previously been working on. And then we'll ask them some questions around that. So we really want to dig into their mental model to make sure that they, again, are able to retrieve it, and they're still remembering those things that you've been working on previously, but also they can articulate the reason why it's important, and they're sharing their insights in terms of why that's really important. Then we move into the agree on step phase, and we've done quite a lot of work around this, and again inspired by Step Lab and Sarah Cottingham. So in this particular phase of the lesson, we want to map their mental model. So we'll sit down with the coachee and we'll start to think about, well, first of all, what was your goal? We think that's really, really important, because we want teachers to be able to take ownership of what they were trying to achieve in that particular part of the lesson. That's also really, really important, and it sets the tone for the coaching conversation. And then after that, we can start to map out their actions. And what we're doing in that process as well, we're looking at the actions, looking at the cause and effect of those actions, and also then really digging into the coach's decision making around it. So it's called the decision drivers. And we're really tapping into those elements of what was your goal and then what actions did you take. And then we have a really nice conversation around, okay, well, how do these actions serve your goal? And often what that leads to is, I don't know if you've read Power of Moments by the Heath brothers, but they talk about like kind of tripping over the truth. And the amount of times now when you're mapping a mental model with a coachee and they really do just spot, oh, okay, well, my goal was to check for understanding, but actually that action that I did there didn't serve that goal. And it's a really nice part of the coaching conversation, because we know that part, and you'll know yourself, Kieran, in terms of coaching, that part of the process where you're starting to move towards what could change and how they could get a little bit better is often that really awkward part of the process. So that mapping of the mental models has just been an absolute game changer for us. So then once we've established that goal and once we've been through that process and we've really, really given the coachee a mental workout in terms of their goal, what the drivers were, what their actions were, and so on and so forth, we then move into the aspect where we've agreed on that step, we've agreed on what it is that we want to work on. Then we're going to invite the coachee to tell us, how do you think you could change that? Like what do you think, what steps do you think you could take in order to kind of solve that problem? If they know, and they've got a strong mental model, as Josh Goodrich calls it, we'll move on to the next aspect. If they've got a partial mental model, we'll ask them more questions. And if they've got a weak mental model, we'll just tell them. And that's very much the process that we'll take throughout the coaching conversation. It's not about whether they're an expert teacher and they've been teaching 15 years, or whether they're a novice teacher and they've been teaching 5 months. It's about what their mental model is and how strong their mental model is for that particular aspect of the lesson or whatever it is that we're trying to improve. Then the last part of this coaching conversation will very much replicate the group rehearsal. So it'll be, we'll show them a model, we'll look at the success criteria, we'll start to pick out what aspects of the success criteria we can see in that particular model. And then we'll get it on its feet and we'll do as rehearsal, just as I explained in the rehearsal element of it as well. So very much exactly what our professional development looks like. And every teacher in our schools are experiencing that on a weekly basis.
For that kind of system to work, it takes the clarity that you've been able to describe with it at all levels. I mean, in terms of developing and like moving forward as a trust, is it just the maintenance and making sure that things continue to work as effectively as they are, or are you always looking for those small sort of incremental steps, or is it a mixture of both? What's your long-term game plan?
Yeah, I think for now, we obviously, in terms of every school's at different points in their journey, in terms of it, particularly in instructional coaching, we think that the rehearsal element of it is really, really strong, and the knowledge building aspect of it. But I think it's that continuing process, because, I'm doing the Step Lab coaching certificate of leadership, the CCL, this year. So I think I put a lot of time and space into my coaching and how I coach. And even still, I'm learning so much about coaching. Like I really do feel that coaching is almost like learning how to teach again. Like it literally is that same process, and that's the way I view it. So I think for us, we've got that North Star of wanting every single coach in our trust to be as good a coach as they possibly can be. So it's this continual evolution around what great coaching looks like. There's also always elements of coaching that we can get better at, and I genuinely see coaching going the same way that teaching has gone, in terms of those videos and those, almost, I think eventually maybe we'll be talking in 10 years time and there'll be like a complete Step Lab, as it is at the minute, for coaching. I think it's going to get to that point, because there's so many intricacies of coaching that you have to learn. And obviously we know as well that just because you're a great teacher doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a good coach. So I think for us, it's that continual involvement in terms of making sure that those systems, some of the things as well in terms of, like, there can be circumstantial changes. So you've got to make sure that you've got that sustainability in place. Like if you've got a school that have got 4 coaches and then something changes and you haven't got any other coaches waiting in the wings, that's also really important. So for us, it's that ongoing process of, fair enough, we've got a great coaching team in this particular school, or we've got great coaching teams, but actually how are we continuing to evolve that and making sure that we've got that sustained element of our leadership as well. But yeah, I think for us, it's just that continuing process of that we're never the finished article, we never arrive. So we're just going to continue to try and get even better. But then what we'll also do as well is some really interesting stuff as well. Is I didn't touch too much about the kind of like, so I think obviously in teaching, your job really is to teach something and then check whether students have learnt it. And I think it's very much the same when it comes to professional development. Your job is to teach things and ensure that staff are able to know, do and decide in the correct way. But then also you've got to continually build those really good systems to check that that's continually happening and map out what that's looking like. So if we think back to that Matt Evans work that I was talking about in terms of mapping the reality of the school, that's really, really important for us. So ensuring that we're continually like checking in on the data. So some really interesting things that we can do is At a school level, we use tags on StepLab. So what that will do is when we're dropping into sessions, we're getting data. So we've tagged all of the fundamental learning problems. So like build, culture, drive, thought, and so on. And then within that, we start to think about, well, what are the particular elements of those fundamental learning problems that we think are really, really important? So when we go into a lesson, we'll tag what things we think are working really, really well. We'll tag it. And then we can also, whatever next steps we might give, we'll also tag that as well. So what we can do over time is build up a picture of, in that particular school, every week in our SLT meetings, what we'll do is we'll pull up that data. We'll filter the drop-ins. So, okay, let's look at our drop-ins now and let's start to think about the positive drop-ins that we're seeing. Great. Well, we're seeing a lot of tags around securing attention. That's what we want to see because that's been our focus. Actually, as a bigger picture, if we think back to that floodlight element of it, we're seeing quite a lot of tags in terms of next steps in this particular area. So that might be a potential area that we need to focus on. So that's a continuing process. And what we start to do now is build systems so we can do that not only at a school level, but also at a trust level as well. So really, really useful data for us.
Is that your approach to gathering evidence, for whether or not things are working? So it's not almost like the old-fashioned accountability approach. It's those tags that drive your decision making as a senior leader across the trust.
I think there's lots of, you talk about triangulation, don't you? The tags are a really great element because that's giving us some kind of like headline figures, but you've still got to dig a little bit deeper. One of the things, this was inspired by Anya from the StepLab team. She spoke about, in one of our StepLab modules, she spoke about, it's called Genbutsu. And it's essentially from Toyota, and that means just go and see. And what I meant is in Toyota, if they feel there's a particular problem, you just need to go and see it for yourself. So for us, that's the power of drop-ins. What we're not just going to rely on is those tags. We want to make sure that we're in lessons as much as we possibly can. And when we say we're in lessons, it's not I'm going to stand at the back with my clipboard and weigh whether or not, coming back to Matt Evans' work, weigh whether or not this is a good lesson or whether or not you've done that technique in the way that I wanted you to do it. I'm going to be in this lesson and try and be as present as I possibly can to just get a feel for, is this the right thing that we need to be working on? How can I support you in terms of solving these problems? How's that landing for you in terms of your classroom? Because you know these learners much better than I do. So for us, it's about being as present as we possibly can. And we call them spotlight tours. But we're not doing it from a point where we're going to be assessing whether or not what we certainly don't want to do is, and this is the same when we're thinking about coaching as well. We're never saying whether a lesson was good. Often you'll hear teachers, they'll come speak to you and they'll say, was it any good? And I'm just kind of like, I'm not really, it's not about whether it was good. It's about how can we make it a little bit better? I'm not going to evaluate the whole lesson. I'm just here to be another pair of eyes to try and help you get a little bit better, as we're all trying to do. So that's the first thing for us. It's just go and see, make sure we're as present as possible, make sure we're getting as many, we call it artifacts. So when we're in lessons, we want artifacts to show that students are learning things. It's the same when we're thinking about our professional development. We want as many different artifacts as possible that are going to tell us whether or not this particular aspect is landing. So that doesn't necessarily just mean that we're in lessons. It can be speaking to staff, speaking to students. All of those things are a continual process. So we're kind of building that picture up over time as to whether or not we're working on the right thing and also whether that thing is having an impact.
I think, I certainly want to visit because this sounds like a really, really effective way to make sort of meaningful change at scale. Where can people reach you? So you're on LinkedIn, you still on X, Blue Sky, any of those, Scott? Where can people reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah. I'm on LinkedIn. What I'll do is I'm on LinkedIn mainly for me now. Yeah, that's definitely where I'm focusing on.
Too right. Well, I'll point people in your direction on LinkedIn. Don't want to give your email address out, then you get absolutely bombarded by
yeah
randoms and stuff. Because I mean, it sounds like the ideal. So it does. And I think lots of people will be really interested just to come visit, to talk to you more about, because if we look at your approach to that learning design, and I reckon we could have a 5-hour conversation about that easily. Because there's so much depth of thought has been put into each of those steps in that process, and so I think thank you so much for giving us an insight into it, because I think it'll be something that people are thinking about, and the reading list alone, people are going to be diving into that for quite some time. So I think all I say to do is say thank you very much for joining me, and hopefully this is just the first of many conversations we have about professional development.
Yeah, great, Kieran. Look forward to that. Thanks for having me. Really, really enjoyed that.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.